But we'll begin with Joachim. So Joachim, thank you for coming.
Thanks very much, Chris. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really delighted to have the pleasure to be here in Hungary once again and to talk to such a distinguished audience. I don't know if some of you might know that I've been working with Deutsche Telekom at these older times, MATAV, from 2001 to 2004 as a regulatory advisor, and it was really always a pleasure to be here, and living in Budapest was simply the best. So let's have a look what I'm going to present today, and I'm going to talk about challenges of operators, especially in rural and remote areas, how to reach everyone. I will briefly give you an overview, and some of the issues we already have tackled in the presentations before. It's the importance of ICT and the different technologies to deliver broadband access, mobile and fixed, and challenges for broadband rollout in rural areas. And then we should also look how we can reach a complementary approach to have a complementary fixed and mobile strategy. I will end with some recommendations, which I'm happy to discuss with you, of course, afterwards. First of all, let me lead over to the benefits of broadband for GDP growth and employment. We have already heard this from our FCC colleague that one of the most important issues are the GDP growth potentials with regard to broadband rollout. What we've learned in the World Bank study already from 2009 is that 10% increase in broadband leads to all over GDP growth of 1.2%. And this is quite a major, not only short-term, but mid-term and long-term objective. And there are also studies around, and this study I show on the right side is a study from Columbia Institute for Teleinformation by Professor Katz. He looked at the German ambitions and goals in the National Broadband Project. And what he discovered was that covering 50% of households with FTTH in 2020 and VDSL of 30%, this would lead to a GDP increase for Germany of 171 billion euros in the time from 2010 to 2020. And this does not only come from, so to say, the investments which are done, of course, construction work and so on, but also with regard to network externalities, enhanced innovation, and then resulting from that new services and business growth. And of course, I think we have to leverage this broadband experience to all our markets, and I think this is one of the major goals which we saw also presented by Bernd Langeheine this morning. But how to reach this really necessary broadband uptake? That leads me to my next slide. And broadband, in this respect, is possible not only via mobile or via fixed, but also by mobile technologies. But only in the long term, fixed is the only solution to really reach the gigabyte society. And this is actually what we're talking about. We're not talking about 5 or 10 megabit per second. We're talking about 100 megabit per second. And we've already discussed this, I think, in depth in the other presentations. But what we have to take into account here is now what are the characteristics and costs for this broadband deployment which we would like to see in all our markets, being it fixed or mobile. And therefore I put on a slide which shows the challenges for building up broadband in remote areas, and this is of course arising from significant higher rollout costs in rural areas. And if you look, for example, on the left side, the specifics for rollout costs for mobile. And rural areas are characterized by a low population density, and that's why we require a bigger cell radius, so bigger propagation to achieve efficient coverage. And what you can see on the chart on the left side is that if you have investment of 100% based on digital dividend spectrum around 700 megahertz. It goes up to 5 times almost if we look at the UMTS frequencies, for example, at 2,500 megahertz. And this is something which we have to take into account when we're talking about how to achieve broadband goals in rural areas via mobile. In fixed, I think you're very much aware with this chart on the right side, because there we are talking about these areas, as the Commission put it, white, grey and black areas. Number one, the black area is the one where we see infrastructure competition, where the profitability possibilities are such that private investment is there, competition is happening. Then the second one is the no man's land of fiber. This is the one where we're very uncertain whether investment will take place due to risk of profitability. There we have to address especially this area with the adequate regulatory environment, and we have to look at different kinds of parameters for rollout cost. And last but not least, the state aid case. These are those areas, the white areas, where we might not see any investment by private companies due to too low profitability expectations. But having said this with regards to the mobile and fixed environment, I would briefly like to look to the interplay of mobile and fixed and how mobile and fixed can complement each other. And if we look on the next slide, we see this green landscape, and we have to take into account that for short-term goals, building out networks on a mobile basis is something where we can achieve the broadband of today, let's say, so to say, the DSL speed, but on the other hand, as I already said, mid and long term, we have to rely on fixed broadband FTTX technologies. And one showcase to give you for achieving these short-term goals in a really short way is the German example, where I think you can see how this will develop based on the auction, frequency auction, which took place in Germany in April and May last year. And this is, I think, the right way forward with regard to all the frequency issues, which we will also hear and discuss this afternoon. What you can see is that this auction had a huge amount of spectrum released. It was 360 megahertz, the biggest auction we've ever seen in Germany. The amount of money spent by operators was 4.3 billion euros. And with the mix, and this is the important thing here, with the mix of digital dividend spectrum and also higher bandwidth spectrum for dense areas, I think we found in Germany a very good mix to really now deploy broadband in the short term on a mobile basis. And what you see on the right side is exactly that all over Germany will be covered at the end of 2012 by Deutsche Telekom, and the other operators, of course, will also invest in this respect. We will achieve 5 to 10 megabit per second by the end of 2012. And I think this also can show Hungary and of course the radio spectrum policy in the EU a way forward how a very deliberate setup of the auction and then the start of the rollout can really achieve something in this respect. However, and I've talked here about the short-term achievements which can be reached, we have to look at, of course, mid- and long-term challenges to really make the gigabit society happen. And this is, of course, only possible if we have private investment in rural and remote areas, or those areas which are more difficult from a profitability point of view, and also competition to avoid, in this ultimate state aid case, or reduce state subsidies. Because, of course, we also know, if we look around Europe and we see that 300 billion euros are necessary to invest from some, what we know from some studies, Germany at all 60 billion euros. This will not only come from private investment, it will also come from state subsidies or EU funds, but there, of course, we have to find the right balance, and we know that, of course, with regard to budget deficits and of course, restricted funds on EU level as well, we will not be able to cover everything in this respect.